Welcome to the Seekers Forum guest interview series. It's great to have spoken to Dr. Gabor Mate about the mother's gaze and how that affects our later development emotionally as well as socially. Gabor Mate, of course, is a renowned speaker and best-selling author who's best known for his expertise on early childhood development, addiction, and stress. He was born in Hungary in 1944 and survived the Holocaust, then immigrated to Canada, where he's been a physician in private practice for many years. He's won numerous awards, including the Hubert Evans Prize for Literary Nonfiction and the Martin Luther King Humanitarian Award, and written several best-selling books, including In the Realm of the Hungry Ghosts, When the Body Says No, and Scattered Minds, a new look at the origins and healing of attention disorder. It was great to talk to Gabor Mate. He's a profound and sensitive soul, and I think you're going to enjoy this interview. Welcome, Dr. Mate. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure, Mark.
Thank you. I'd like to start by quoting something that you have said that goes to the heart of what I wanted to talk about. You said, "A hurt is at the center of all addictive behaviors." And what I'm wondering about is if the hurt is early parental loss or lack of bonding, how does that connect possibly to addiction later in life?
Well, can I begin with a question?
Yes.
So let me define addiction for you as any behavior that a person craves, finds pleasure or relief in, and continues with it despite negative consequences. So any behavior, which could be substances related, or it could be sex or gambling or shopping or eating or anything else. Mm-hmm. So by that standard, is it okay if I ask you if you've had any addictive behavior in your life ever? And I'm not asking what it was or when, just anything.
Yes, absolutely I have.
Okay. The next question then is not what was wrong with it, but what was right about it? What did it do for you? What did you like about it?
In my case, it was smoking cigarettes, and my mother had been a very heavy smoker, and I think that smoking... Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just asking, what did you get from it? What did you like about it?
I got comfort.
Comfort?
Yeah.
Okay, if you got comfort, if you needed to be comforted, that means that you're having discomfort in your life. So that the cigarette was not, the addiction was not your primary problem. Your primary problem was the discomfort that you're trying to soothe. In other words, the addiction is nothing more than a coping mechanism. It's not a disease, it's not a choice, it's simply an attempt to soothe some kind of emotional pain, some kind of emotional discomfort. I'm suggesting that discomfort, that emotional pain, that distress originates in childhood in every case of addiction.
And if saying that it originates in childhood, you're obviously including earliest childhood and bonding with the mother or the primary caretaker?
I'm referring specifically to our relationship with our primary caregivers, and it begins not only in early childhood but even in the womb already. In other words, we know that when either animals or in a laboratory or women are stressed during pregnancy, that already has an impact on the infant, even in the womb already, and it increases the risk of addictive behavior later on in both animals and human beings. So it's some kind of distress that the young creature experiences early in his or her development that then leads to the need for soothing later on. Now, most often it does happen in early childhood, relatively early in childhood, and it's not a question of blaming the parent or the mother. It's a question of asking what was the emotional state and the circumstance of the caregiver that may have caused her not to be able to connect with the infant in the way that the infant needed.
Right.
Then there are, of course, obvious cases of trauma and abuse and all that, and the more trauma and abuse there is, the greater the risk of addiction. But it doesn't have to be trauma or abuse in the overt sense. It could just be an emotional disconnect, despite the parents with the best intentions.
Is it possible to get through a childhood without some distress or discomfort of the kind that you're describing?
In our society, it's almost impossible, which is why addictions are so rife. If you look at other cultures, For example, hunter-gatherer cultures where infants are with their parents all the time, they're picked up, they're not hit, and they're never allowed to cry. I mean, in other words, before they cry, they're picked up and comforted. You're not going to see addictive behaviors. But as soon as you have stresses on the parenting environment that separate the parents from their extended families and from the clan and the tribe, so parents are more burdened now. As soon as you have insecurity, that affects the parents without the support of the larger group. As soon as you have parents who are carrying childhood trauma themselves that's not resolved, it's almost impossible for the child to avoid some of this impact. So in our society, the answer is virtually no. Which is why, again, addictions are so rife in our society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what about specifically the connection between attachment disorder or insecure attachment and addiction? Could you draw a corollary between those?
Well, again, if you understand addiction as a complex phenomena, but which is primarily aimed at soothing some kind of pain or distress, then the more hurt the child is emotionally, the more likely they are to be programmed to seek soothing behaviors later on. And this always has to do with the attachment relationship with the primary caregivers.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, attachment loss is a template for a potential template for addictive behavior later on. And the other point I need to make here, Mike, is that these attachment problems are not just the emotional dynamics. We now know that they actually affect brain development.
Mm-hmm.
So that the quality of a parental bond, the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships has an impact on the very physiology of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at addiction from the perspective of brain physiology, the circuits that are involved in addiction actually are shaped by the early environment. And when there's difficulties for the parents in providing that secure attachment to the child, that affects the physiology, chemistry of the child's brain.
It's so fascinating. And it leads to my next question. You've spoken about studies that connect stress, abuse, and lack of love and attachment to deficiencies in the ability to process endorphins and dopamine, neurochemicals in our bodies. I'm wondering, what are the implications of that outside of the addictive sphere of our lives, in the rest of our lives?
Well, so again, studies overwhelming. They show that the more stress there is in an infant's life, the less developed the dopamine circuitry is, so that the child's incentive motivation circuitry is less developed. And secondly, the endorphin circuitry, endorphins being, an endorphin means endogenous morphine-like substance, so endorphin. And so if you look at the role of endorphins in human life, that circuitry is negatively affected by early stress. And what do endorphins do? Well, first of all, they're emotional pain relievers and physical pain relievers, number one. Number two, they make possible experiences of pleasure and reward. So you can see why somebody with disturbed endorphin apparatus due to early stress will be more likely to soothe themselves with opiates later on.
Mm-hmm.
But the third thing that the opiates do, the third thing and the most important thing that the opiates do, is they help to modulate the attachment relationship itself. So with that endorphin apparatus, we don't feel very attached, we're connected. And that affects empathy and connection to other people and our capacity to connect later on. So that the endorphin apparatus, if it's disturbed in its development, will have huge impact on our relationships and how we feel about the world and our capacity to connect with the world in a emotionally open and compassionate kind of way. And incidentally, not just the endorphins, but also the oxytocin. Oxytocin is another brain chemical that is very important. You know, it helps to initiate labor. It helps to modulate the breast letdown reflex for breastfeeding, and it also is an important chemical for loving connection between people. And so, for example, autistic kids treated with oxytocin seem to do better. They're better able to connect with people. And, you know, what marks autism is the difficulty connecting with people. Now, people then who are developing under stress circumstances may have diminished endorphin and oxytocin activity, which means that their ability to connect with others later on in life could be severely affected.
And so what can one do who has been traumatized in that way, who has that kind of a chemical deficiency? As a clinician, what do you recommend that people do?
Well, first of all, the good news is that the brain, although it's shaped very much by early experiences, also retains its capacity for development even later on. And we know this. Obviously, it's better if we get it right in the first place. But it's not impossible to develop new circuits or to override the old ones, even later on.
Gotcha.
And so, if you ask the question of what is trauma, it's rather complex, but we tend to think of trauma as bad things happening to us. But that's not the essence of trauma. Trauma is not what happens to us. Trauma is what happens inside of us as a result of what happens to us.
So interesting.
And what happens in trauma, the essence of trauma is a disconnect from ourselves. So we disconnect from our bodies, our gut feelings, and our emotions. And that's good news, because if the trauma, see, I know what happened to me. I don't know what happened to you, but I know what happened to me. You know, terribly stressed, wartime, Budapest, Hungary, Jewish mother, Nazi occupation, you can guess the rest. Separation from my mother when I was 8 years old. Now, the problem, if that was the trauma, then I'm rather stuck, because all that happened 72 years ago, and I can't change what happened 72 years ago. But if the trauma is not those things, but what those things cause inside myself, which is a disconnect from myself, from my body, my gut feelings, from my emotions, that I can regain. I can regain a connection with myself. So the essence of trauma healing is a reconnection. And so no matter how people go about treating trauma, whether with compassionate psychotherapy, whether with body work, whether with somatic experiencing work, whether with EMDR, whether with psychedelic work, whatever it is that people do, the aim of trauma work is to reconnect that person to themselves. And that can be done.
Beautiful. It's beautiful. I'd like to ask you about the spiritual dimension of addiction that Jung called addiction a prayer gone awry. How do you see that playing out in the people that you work with and in your own experience, the spiritual dimension of what addiction is in essence?
Well, the French philosopher Blaise Pascal has a wonderful phrase. He said that inside every human being there's a God-shaped hole. In other words, there's a deep longing for connection with creation, a deep longing for connection with the larger entity, which is the world, the universe that we're all a part of. And of course, any sense of disconnect from the physical and broader universe that we're a part of is simply an illusion. But especially in the Western world, we're very much programmed to experience ourselves as individualistic and separate. And that leaves us with a tremendous emptiness. And we try and fill that hole with any number of things. So at the heart of addiction, there's not just the trauma and the disconnect we've been talking about. There's also spiritual emptiness. And so for some people, the pursuit of addictive behaviors is really their attempt to feel whole and connected. And I think that as part of addiction treatment and as part of that reconnecting with ourselves that we've been talking about, we have to recognize that there's a spiritual dimension to it. In other words, and that's essentially what the 12-step groups talk about. They talk about it in particularly religious language that turns some people off. But what they're really talking about underneath their religiosity is that connection with the larger creative spirit that we're all a part of. And if you look at the traditional native medicine of North America, they have this medicine wheel concept where human health you picture it as a wheel with four quadrants, that includes the physical, the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual. And when we miss any one of them, we're unhealthy, we're unbalanced. So spirituality, in the sense of that connection, is simply a part of who we are as human beings.
Mm.
And in not experiencing it, we're actually missing a part of ourselves.
Yeah. Beautiful. And one last question, please. I'm interested to know, what are you excited about in the field of healing, addiction, trauma studies? Is there anything in particular that you're finding exciting at the moment?
Well, I just came back from a speaking trip that took me to Ottawa, Ontario, and then Boston, Massachusetts. I just came back last night. And what's exciting to me is the increasing recognition of the importance of trauma and the healing of trauma in the healing of addiction, and not just of addiction, by the way, but mental illness in general and even physical illness. And unfortunately, my profession, the medical profession, is very much trained to separate mind from body, not even to consider spirituality, of course, and to ignore the role of trauma. The average medical student still, despite all the studies, despite all the scientific evidence, despite all the brain developmental data that I've just given you, still doesn't hear the word trauma. 4 years or 5 years of medical school.
That's incredible.
It's really astonishing. I know it's incredible, but it's the state of it's the unfortunate state of the profession. Psychologists are often not trained in trauma. Certainly politicians have no awareness of it. And so the result is that instead of recognizing addiction and mental illness in general, and many other conditions, as the natural outcomes of unnatural circumstances, we see them as sort of separate diseases or perhaps as behavioral problems. And what's exciting to me is that there's so much research now that's being published, and there's so much more awareness now on the part of many caregivers, and there's so much eagerness to learn about this stuff and to recognize how trauma-informed care is the essential cornerstone. And this is happening on a large scale now in your country, the United States, and my country, Canada. It's far from mainstream yet, but at the same time, it's burgeoning. And to me, that's tremendously exciting, because I think we're finally looking in the right direction. It's going to be a while yet, but at least we're more than beginning to appreciate the importance of those early experiences, how they affect us as human beings, how they shape our worldview, how they program in us coping patterns that are meant to endure trauma and stress, but which later on become problems as the addictive shooting is, and how we can work with these in positive ways.
Beautiful. Thank you. Gabor Mate, it's really been an honor talking to you. Thank you so much, and good luck with all of your work.
Thank you. Thank you very much.